An old junkyard worker gave a lost bike new life. Hell's Angels gave him one too. Please don't take the only thing I still know how to fix, Benedict Arlo said, his voice cracking over the steel table. I can leave the building, but let me save the engine first. The 68-year-old watchman stood with both palms flat beside a cracked engine block, his gray work shirt burned brown at one cuff, his boots dusted with black slag, and an immediate eviction notice pinned under a greasy socket wrench showing the exact payout. $3,450. It was 2:17 p.m., and Malcolm Greer had already reminded him this was the final clearance deadline after weeks of posted notices. The demolition crew would roll through the foundry doors at 4 o'clock sharp, whether Benedict was finished or not. Then the iron gate groaned outside. A low V-twin rumble rolled through the broken window panes, and Cyrus, Iron Jaw, Fenwick stepped into the foundry light, his creaking Hell's Angel-style leather vest hanging over shoulders as wide as a doorway, his massive shadow swallowing Benedict's thin frame and the cracked engine between them. Nobody spoke for 3 seconds. The old foundry seemed to hold its breath. Cold light leaked through shattered glass high above the floor, catching on rusted conveyor chains, hanging hooks, and flakes of iron dust that floated like ash over the workbenches. The place smelled of old engine oil, wet rust, burnt metal, and the bitter slag that had settled into every wall long before Benedict's beard turned white. Malcolm Greer stood near the office door in polished shoes and a charcoal coat too clean for the room, tapping the edge of his folder against one palm as if he were waiting for a slow waiter instead of watching a man lose the last corner of his life. This is private redevelopment property now, Malcolm said. The compensation has been offered. The deadline is documented. Mr. Arlo is simply refusing to be reasonable. Benedict lowered his eyes. He did not look like a rebel. He looked like a tired man who had spent too many winters checking locks, shutting valves, and making sure no one got hurt in a building everyone else had already decided was dead. Cyrus took one step closer, heavy boots grinding grit against concrete, his gray beard cut hard around a mouth that looked built for silence. A pale scar ran from his left cheek into the beard, and old road dust clung to the seams of his leather. He did not raise his voice. He did not move toward Malcolm. He only looked at the cracked engine block the way a doctor might look at an X-ray, slow and exact. That yours? Cyrus asked. Benedict swallowed. Not legally, maybe. It was left here years ago with the frame of an old bike. I kept it covered. Kept the mice out of the wiring. I thought if I could get this block sealed, maybe I could hear it run once before they tore the roof down. A loose chain overhead gave a small metallic tick. Short and cold. Malcolm laughed under his breath, but the sound died when the other adult bikers entered behind Cyrus, each one broad, quiet, road-worn, carrying no threat except the calm weight of men who knew tools better than talk. Their headlights still burned through the open gate, throwing white bars across the floor and over the notice marked $3,450. Cyrus reached down, picked up the paper by one corner, read the number, then set it back under the wrench exactly where Benedict had placed it. His eyes shifted to the fracture line in the block, thin as a black vein through old iron. Who told you this was scrap? He asked. Benedict looked from the engine to Malcolm, then back to the floor. Everybody. Cyrus nodded once, almost to himself. Then everybody didn't look close enough. Cyrus did not touch the engine at first. He circled the steel table once, slow enough that Benedict could hear the leather of his vest creak over the low idle of the Harleys outside, slow enough that Malcolm Greer's polished confidence began to look out of place beside the rust, the slag dust, and the old yellow work lights swinging above them. The cracked block sat between them like a verdict, heavy, scarred, and still warm near the seam where Benedict had tried to weld it before his hands started shaking. Cyrus leaned closer, squinted along the fracture, then rubbed one thumb through a line of black residue, without flinching. Cast iron, he said. Old. Stubborn. Doesn't forgive heat if you rush it. Benedict blinked as if those were the first kind words anyone had spoken to the machine in years. I preheated it, he said quickly, embarrassed by how eager he sounded. Not enough, maybe. I only had the small torch left. Main gas line got shut off Monday. I had the clamp set at 6 inches, but the table's warped by nearly a quarter. He pointed to a dented machinist's ruler, a chipped soapstone pencil, and 3 grade 8 bolts laid out in a neat row on a rag. Everything he owned looked poor, but nothing looked careless. Cyrus noticed that. Malcolm did not. "This is touching," Malcolm said, glancing at his watch. But sentiment does not pause demolition schedules. One of the adult bikers behind Cyrus, a broad white man with a shaved head and oil-darkened hands, shifted his weight near the doorway, but Cyrus lifted 2 fingers without looking back. The man stopped. No anger, no rush, just restraint. Benedict saw it and misunderstood the silence. His shoulders pulled inward. "If you came for the bike," he said to Cyrus, "I won't fight you over it. I know men like you can use old parts. Just don't let him crush it flat. Please." It was not trash when it came in here, and it should not leave as trash. Cyrus turned his eyes from the engine to the old watchman. They were pale gray, hard from road glare, but not cruel. "Men like me?" he asked. Benedict's face reddened. "I didn't mean, you meant leather, patches, beards, loud pipes," Cyrus said. "That what you saw?" Benedict looked down at his burned cuff and the notice under the socket wrench. "I saw people strong enough to take what they wanted." The foundry went quiet except for the tick of cooling metal and the far rattle of a loose chain in the overhead track. Then Cyrus reached into the pocket of his vest and took out an old silver coin, rubbed thin from years of being carried. He placed it on the corner of the immediate eviction notice, pinning the paper flat beside the printed $3,450. "Strength is knowing what not to take," he said. Short and plain. Benedict's throat moved, but no words came. Cyrus walked toward the shadowed rear bay where the motorcycle frame rested under a stained canvas tarp. Benedict hurried after him, moving with the stiff caution of a man whose knees had climbed too many metal stairs on too many cold nights. The tarp came off with a dry hiss. Under it sat the bones of an old motorcycle, a faded frame, a dented fuel tank, 1 cracked leather seat, 2 wire wheels, and a handlebar wrapped in brittle black tape. A bent license plate hung from a hook on the wall beside it, tagged in Benedict's careful handwriting. "Foundry Bay 3, stored parts, do not scrap." Cyrus crouched beside the frame, not like a scavenger, but like a mechanic entering a conversation that had been waiting for him. He ran 2 fingers along the neck, checked the welds, looked at the mounting points, then glanced back at the cracked block on the table. "You kept every piece?" "Every piece I could find," Benedict said. 14 years. Maybe 15. Night shift gets long in winter. Sorting parts gave me something to do besides listen to the pipes knock. Malcolm exhaled loudly. "This property has been purchased for redevelopment, not an antique therapy session." Cyrus did not answer him. He looked at a cardboard box full of labeled bolts, a coffee can marked carb screws, and a small ledger Benedict had filled with dates, measurements, and notes in pencil. The old man had not just guarded the foundry. He had guarded a forgotten machine as if it still had a future. Cyrus stood, massive in the dim light, and looked back toward the cracked engine. "You didn't keep junk," he said. "You kept a promise." Benedict's eyes shone, but he turned away before anyone could see too much. Outside, the Harley headlights burned through the gate, bright on the concrete, steady as a line drawn in chalk. Malcolm checked his watch again. It was 2:29 p.m. Malcolm Greer stepped deeper into the foundry as if the concrete belonged to him already, though the floor still carried Benedict's broom marks, and the lock chains still hung from hooks Benedict had oiled every Friday for 26 years. His polished shoes clicked through gray dust, his charcoal coat brushed against a rust-stained post, and the sharp scent of expensive cologne cut through the old engine oil like something sprayed over a wound. He stopped near the motorcycle frame and looked at Benedict's handwritten tags with a thin smile. "This is exactly why the owners wanted a clean sweep," he said. "Too many men get sentimental about dead equipment and start confusing memory with value." Benedict's fingers tightened around the edge of the tarp. He did not answer. Cyrus stood beside the frame, broad and still, the light from the open gate catching the scar on his cheek and the worn edges of his Hell's Angels-style leather vest. Behind him, the other adult bikers waited in silence, their faces rough from road wind, their hands scarred by years of wrenches, chains, and stubborn bolts. They looked dangerous to anyone who only understood appearances. They did not move. Malcolm lifted his folder and tapped it twice against his palm. Mr. Arlo was offered $3,450 in relocation compensation. That is more generous than required, considering he has no ownership claim to this property or any materials stored inside. The final clearance schedule has been posted for weeks. The liability window closes at 4. Anything left afterward becomes disposable site material. Benedict's face went pale under the foundry grime, but his voice stayed careful. I asked for one more day. You asked for special treatment, Malcolm said. There is a difference. A loose pane of glass rattled high above them, and a strip of weak light trembled across the cracked fuel tank. Cyrus turned his head slightly, not toward Malcolm's voice but toward Benedict's breath, the way it caught at the end of each sentence. The old man had spent decades guarding doors, checking gauges, and walking empty aisles after midnight, so other grown men could go home safe. Now he was being measured like debris. That was the wound in the room. Cyrus took 3 slow steps back to the steel table where the cracked engine block waited under the yellow work lamp. He picked up Benedict's chipped machinist's ruler, laid it along the fracture, and studied the seam without touching the weld. This crack didn't start from heat alone, he said. Malcolm gave a short laugh. Now the biker is an engineer. Cyrus did not look up. No, a mechanic who listens. The words landed flat and calm. One of the bikers outside killed his Harley engine, and the sudden quiet made the foundry feel even bigger, even colder, filled with the faint drip of water from a broken pipe and the soft tick of cooling iron. Benedict looked at the crack as if it might accuse him. I tried to save it, he said. I know it looks bad. It looks mishandled, Cyrus said. See that edge? That's not a clean fatigue line. Something pinched it wrong, or dropped it wrong, before you ever lit that torch. Malcolm's smile thinned. Careful. Accusations can create problems. Cyrus finally raised his eyes. He was not angry in a loud way. He was worse than that for a man like Malcolm. Patient, observant, and not impressed. Then we won't accuse, Cyrus said. We'll inspect. Benedict stared at him, confused by the kindness hidden inside the rough voice. Malcolm stepped closer to the table, stopping just outside the oil stain beneath it, refusing to let the grime touch his shoes. There is nothing to inspect. This facility is scheduled for final redevelopment clearance. Mr. Arlo was retained as a temporary watchman, not a curator, not a mechanic, not a historian. His job was to keep trespassers out until the handover. Benedict flinched at the word temporary, though he had worn the same brass key ring on his belt since 1998. Cyrus noticed that too. He noticed everything. The brass keys, the neat boxes, the labeled bolts, the burned cuff, the way Benedict stood between Malcolm and the engine even when he was afraid. Then Cyrus reached for the socket wrench holding down the eviction notice and set it beside the block with a soft clank. A man who keeps order in a dead place is still doing a living job, he said. Benedict blinked hard and looked away toward the hanging conveyor chain. Malcolm's jaw tightened. For the first time since he walked in, the project manager looked less like a man giving orders and more like a man whose clean paperwork had been dragged into dirty light. Outside, the white bars of the Harley headlights stretched farther across the floor, touching the old motorcycle frame, the cracked block, and Benedict's worn boots all at once. The deadline was still coming, but the room had changed. Cyrus pulled the yellow work lamp lower until its dented shade hung 8 inches above the engine block, and the foundry seemed to shrink around that small circle of light. He took Benedict's soapstone pencil, marked the start of the fracture, then traced the thin black line to a rough crescent near the mounting ear where the metal had been crushed before it split. The mark was small, no wider than a dime, but Cyrus stared at it as if it were a signature. There, he said, that's where the story starts. Benedict's breath caught. Malcolm shifted near the office door, his expensive cologne still sharp in the air, but now it mixed with hot dust, old oil, and the sour iron smell rising from the table. This is ridiculous, Malcolm said. It is a damaged object in a facility scheduled for clearance. Nothing more. Cyrus did not answer him. He reached for a flat file, cleaned one edge of the crack with 2 careful strokes, then held the file under the light so Benedict could see the gray dust on its teeth. Fresh stress scar under old dirt, Cyrus said. This block was pinched hard before you tried to weld it. Clamped jaw, maybe. Or a bad lift. Benedict stared at the crushed crescent. His weathered face changed so slightly that most men would have missed it, but Cyrus had spent too many years reading machines and men on the side of highways. Shame moved through the old watchman before fear did. Quietly. Mr. Arlo, Cyrus said softer now. What happened? Benedict looked toward the rear bay, where the motorcycle frame sat under the weak bars of headlight shining through the gate. For a long moment, he seemed to listen to the building. The loose conveyor chain ticking above, water dripping from a broken pipe into a 5-gallon bucket, wind pushing grit across the floor like dry sandpaper. Then his hand went to the brass key ring at his belt. 3 months ago, he said, Malcolm brought in a removal crew after hours. All grown men, temporary contractors. They were supposed to tag the heavy pieces, wait for the rigging company, and leave the old machinery alone until inspection. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. Choose your words carefully. Benedict swallowed, but he did not stop. They were tired. Rushed. One of them set a clamp wrong on the small hoist in Bay 3. The block slipped maybe 2 feet, not enough to shatter, but enough to hit the edge of the pallet jack. I heard it from the office. He pointed to the crushed crescent with one trembling finger. That sound doesn't leave you. Cyrus stayed still. You reported it? Benedict gave a sad little nod. I wrote it in the night log. 9:48 p.m. clamp angle wrong. Load unsecured. Possible damage. Next morning, the page was gone. The foundry went colder than before. Malcolm stepped forward, but one look from Cyrus stopped him without a hand raised, without a threat, without a single loud word. Just a wall of silence. Benedict's voice dropped lower. One of those men had a wife recovering from surgery. Another was trying to keep his apartment. Malcolm said if I made trouble, the whole crew would be blacklisted from the next contract. So I signed a correction note saying the block was already scrapped and I had misread the lift. His fingers tightened around the keys until they clicked together. I thought I was protecting working men. Maybe I was just too scared to protect the truth. No one mocked him. That mattered. One of the bikers behind Cyrus took off his gloves and set them on a crate, a small gesture of respect in a room full of rust. Cyrus lowered his gaze to the crack again, then to Benedict's burned cuff, then to the neat rows of labeled bolts waiting on the rack. You kept the parts, Cyrus said. You kept the measurements. You kept the time. Benedict nodded once. It was the only way I knew how to say I wasn't lying. Malcolm's voice came out tight. This changes nothing. The building still comes down. Cyrus finally turned fully toward him, leather creaking across his shoulders, his massive shadow reaching over the table and touching the eviction notice. His face stayed calm, almost tired. Metal tells the truth, he said. So do men, when somebody finally gives them room. Benedict looked at the cracked block under the lamp, and for the first time that afternoon, his eyes did not fall to the floor. The secret was out now. It had weight, but it also had air. Cyrus did not ask permission from Malcolm. He asked Benedict, You still know this building's power runs? Benedict looked up, startled by the respect hidden in the question, then nodded toward a gray breaker box bolted beside the old-time clock. Bay 2 still has 240, and I tested the breaker this morning with a meter. The compressor line leaks after 30 pounds, but the west outlet holds steady for removal tools. Main lift is dead. Side table still levels if you block the right foot with a 1/2-inch plate. Cyrus gave one slow nod, and that was all it took for the foundry to wake up. The adult bikers moved with quiet purpose, not like men starting trouble, but like mechanics entering a job that needed clean hands and clear eyes. One rolled a portable work light across the concrete, its cracked rubber wheels crunching over slag dust. Another opened a red steel cabinet and found 2 C-clamps, a worn face shield, and a box of cutting discs marked 4.5 inch, still wrapped in paper yellowed by age. A third man backed one Harley closer to the open gate, so its headlight threw a hard white beam across the table, catching the engine block, the eviction notice, and Benedict's thin hands all in the same light. Another set a charged extinguisher beside the steel table and cleared a 6-foot cutting line, pushing loose rags, paper tags, and dry slag dust away from the sparks. The room changed sound by sound. First came the snap of the breaker, then the cough of the old compressor, then the clean metallic bite of a 9/16 wrench tightening the jaw of a bench vise that had not been used properly in years. Malcolm stood outside the circle of work, gripping his folder tighter as the smell of his cologne drowned under hot dust, old oil, and the bitter tang of metal waking under pressure. You cannot just reactivate equipment in a site scheduled for clearance, he said. Cyrus did not look at him. Then document us removing personal mechanical property before clearance, he said. and pointed with 2 fingers toward the notice under the socket wrench. Benedict stared at the paper as if seeing it for the first time. There, in small legal print below the bold eviction language, was the line Malcolm had rushed past. Occupant may remove personal tools, records, and stored mechanical property prior to final site clearance, provided removal does not damage real property. Cyrus had found the gap without shouting. That was the cut that mattered. Benedict moved faster after that. Not young, not steady, but alive with memory. He showed them where the floor dipped near Bay 3, where the old gantry rail could not be trusted past the painted red mark, where the steel table needed a shim under the southeast leg. He pulled a dented coffee can from a shelf and poured out labeled bolts, each wrapped in masking tape with pencil marks. Left mount, rear bracket, tank strap, unknown but safe. One biker smiled at the words, but did not laugh. He understood. Cyrus set the cracked block on wood spacers exactly 2 inches apart, then marked 3 separation points in white soapstone, careful not to touch the crushed crescent that proved the bad lift. "We are not fixing it today," he told Benedict. "We are saving it from being ruined worse." Benedict nodded, and the shame in his face loosened by a small degree. Malcolm tried again, this time speaking to the room instead of Cyrus. "The owners will not accept liability if anyone gets hurt." Every biker stopped at once. No one glared. No one advanced. Cyrus simply lifted the face shield, checked the cracked strap, rejected it, and took another from the cabinet. "Good," he said. "Then we do it right. Short and final." The industrial cutter started with a bright hiss, not wild, not careless, but controlled against the marked edge while another man kept the vacuum hose close enough to catch the dust. Sparks fell in a small orange stream onto a wet fire blanket Benedict had kept folded for years in a drawer nobody else cared to open. The old watchman watched that blanket, then the clamp, then Cyrus's hands. There was no wasted motion. There was no performance. Just skill. The cut freed the damaged mounting ear first, then the seized bracket, then the warped plate that had held the block crooked on the table. Each piece was laid on cardboard and marked with Benedict's pencil. By 2:53 p.m., the motorcycle frame had been rolled clear of the rear bay, the fuel tank was wrapped in an old canvas apron, and 2 boxes of bolts sat in a straight line beside the open gate. Malcolm's phone buzzed again and again, but he no longer sounded like the only clock in the room. The foundry had its own rhythm now. Wrench, breath, chain tick, cutter pause, Benedict's careful voice naming every part before it was moved. Cyrus stepped back once, letting the old man direct the next lift. Benedict hesitated, then pointed to the safer angle. 2 inches left. Keep the weight low. Don't trust that hook. The bikers obeyed him without question. His back straightened. Outside, the Harley headlights burned white against the gray afternoon, and inside, under broken glass and iron dust, a man everyone had called temporary began to look permanent again. The first real pause came after the warped plate dropped free with a dull clunk onto the cardboard, and everyone in the foundry seemed to feel the weight of what had been saved from the crusher. Benedict crouched beside it, one hand braced on his knee, breathing hard but smiling at the edge of his mouth like a man afraid the feeling might disappear if he trusted it too fast. Cyrus wiped his hands on a gray shop rag and set the cracked engine block under the work light, turning it half an inch until the fracture caught the glow just right. "Look here," he said, not to show off, but to teach. Benedict leaned close, and so did 2 of the adult bikers, their leather creaking softly, their faces rough and quiet in the yellow light. The foundry smelled hotter now. Cut metal, old oil, damp concrete, and the faint rubber scent from the Harley tires cooling outside the gate. Cyrus pointed with the soapstone pencil, keeping the tip just above the crack. "This part carries load. This part only held alignment. That crushed ear is done, but the heart of the block is not dead." Benedict listened as if every word were being set carefully back inside him. "You can sleeve damage if the wall is sound. You can replace a bracket if the mount still has truth in it. But you cannot save anything by pretending the crack is not there." Malcolm Greer made a small, impatient sound near the office door, but nobody turned. He had paperwork. They had proof under a lamp. Cyrus picked up the broken mounting ear and placed it beside the block, lining it up so Benedict could see how the bad clamp had twisted the metal before the fall. "You rushed your weld because they rushed your life," Cyrus said. That does not make you careless. Benedict's eyes lowered to his burned cuff. For years, his whole world had been small, exact things. Locks checked at 10 p.m., boiler gauges written down in blue ink, chain hooks counted twice before dawn, floor drains cleared before winter ice could creep under the doors. He had built dignity out of details no one applauded. Then one man in a clean coat called it nothing. It had almost worked. One of the bikers, a quiet white man with a gray braid tucked into his collar, carried over a shallow tray and began placing the freed parts in order. Bracket, spacer, left mount, cracked ear, 2 washers, 6 bolts. Benedict corrected him gently. 8 bolts. 2 rolled under the pallet. The biker looked under the pallet, found both, and set them in the tray without a word. Respect can be that simple. Cyrus nodded toward the tray. That is why we label everything before we move it. A machine remembers what people forget. Benedict gave a soft laugh, the first one that did not sound broken. I used to tell the adult new hires that. They thought I was just old. Old means you have seen enough mistakes to prevent a few, Cyrus said. Short and steady. Malcolm's phone rang again, shrill against the metal walls. He answered in a low voice, turning away, but the foundry gave him no clean corner to hide in. Every step he took left gray dust on his polished shoes. While he spoke, Cyrus had the men set up a second light near the motorcycle frame. Benedict showed them the ledger where he had sketched the original mounting angle with a carpenter's pencil, dated March 12th, with a note that read, "Possible restoration if time allows." Cyrus studied the page, then looked at the old watchman with something softer than pity. "You were not storing parts," he said. "You were keeping something alive." Benedict swallowed, and this time he did not turn away fast enough to hide the wet shine in his eyes. The biker did not embarrass him by naming it. He simply handed him the soapstone pencil. "Mark the next cut." Benedict took it with fingers still stained black from iron dust, drew a clean white line across a seized support tab, and stepped back. The industrial cutter hissed again, controlled and careful, while the old fire blanket caught the sparks in a quiet orange scatter. No one hurried. No one mocked him. Outside, the white headlights stayed fixed through the gate, and inside, under broken glass and dangling chains, Benedict Arlo began to understand the lesson Cyrus had been giving him all along. Cracked did not mean useless, old did not mean finished, and a man could be handled wrong by the world without losing the strongest part of himself. At 3:31 p.m., Malcolm Greer walked back from the office door with his phone pressed flat against his thigh and a new kind of tightness around his mouth. Outside the iron gate, a white clearance truck eased into the yard, followed by 2 adult workers in reflective vests who looked more confused than eager, their hard hats tucked under their arms as they studied the Harleys, the open foundry doors, and the long white beams of headlights stretched across the concrete. Malcolm lifted his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Final clearance begins now. Anything not outside the structure is site material." Benedict froze with the soapstone pencil still in his hand. The old fear came back fast, the kind that had lived in his shoulders for months. But this time Cyrus stepped beside him instead of in front of him. That mattered. The biker's leather vest creaked as he turned, his scarred hands open at his sides, his gray beard catching the work light, while the other adult bikers stopped what they were doing and became still as iron posts along the path between the table and the gate. No one blocked the workers. No one touched Malcolm. They simply stood where a careful crew would have to look, think, and slow down. Malcolm pointed toward the motorcycle frame. "Move it out of the way." Cyrus nodded once toward the open yard, where a 28-foot rollback tow truck had just backed in with its amber lights flashing against the broken windows. The sound of the reverse alarm echoed through the foundry. Beep, breath, beep, breath. Controlled and cold. "Already moving it," Cyrus said. He handed Malcolm the eviction notice, now marked with Benedict's neat pencil notes along the margin. "Stored mechanical property under watchman custody. Removal in progress. No damage to real property." Then Cyrus held up Benedict's ledger, open to the 9:48 p.m. entry about the bad clamp angle and unsecured load, and documenting it. Malcolm's face flushed, but he kept his voice smooth for the workers watching from the gate. "That ledger has no legal standing." "Maybe not," Cyrus said, "but it tells a cleaner story than your missing page." The words were quiet enough that nobody could call them a threat, and plain enough that everyone understood them. Benedict looked at Cyrus, then at the workers, then at the cracked engine block resting on cardboard with every freed piece labeled beside it. His hands trembled once. Then they stopped. He stepped forward on his own, small beside the biker, but no longer shrinking. "I will leave," Benedict said, his voice rough from dust and years of swallowing words. "I will not be dragged by a deadline, and I will not let this machine be crushed because someone in a clean coat is embarrassed by the truth." The clearance workers did not move. One of them looked at Malcolm. They were not afraid of a fight. They were reading the documented removal, the marked parts, and the open path left clear to the gate. Malcolm looked at the headlights, the labeled parts, the ledger, the adult bikers standing silent, and the tow truck waiting exactly where it should be. The power in the room had shifted from volume to procedure. Cyrus turned to Benedict. "Call the lift." Benedict nodded and gave the signals like he had been waiting all his life to be trusted again. 2 inches up. 4 inches left. Keep it low. Watch the hook. The bikers followed every word, guiding the motorcycle frame onto the rolling dolly, then easing the cracked block into a padded crate with a 1/2-inch plywood base and 2 ratchet straps rated for 1,500 pounds. The old conveyor chain ticked overhead as if counting the seconds Malcolm could no longer control. Outside, the rollback ramp lowered with a hydraulic sigh, and cold afternoon light poured across the floor. Malcolm made one last attempt, stepping closer to the line of parts. Cyrus shifted only half a step, not into him, not against him, simply between careless shoes and careful work. His shadow fell across Malcolm's polished toes. "Mind the bolts," Cyrus said. Malcolm looked down. 8 labeled bolts lay in a tray at his feet, each one accounted for because Benedict had insisted on it. For a moment, the project manager seemed trapped by something too small for his pride and too exact for his lies. He stepped back. No cheers came. No one needed them. Benedict picked up the tray himself and carried it toward the gate, past the bikers, past Malcolm, past the notice offering $3,450 for a life's worth of patience, and into the hard white glare of the waiting tow truck. The rollback ramp waited in the yard with its amber lights turning slow circles over the foundry walls, and Benedict carried the tray of 8 labeled bolts as if it were something fragile enough to breathe. Behind him, the motorcycle frame rolled on the dolly with 2 adult bikers guiding it by the rear rails, keeping their boots clear of the cracked concrete and their hands low so the old metal never twisted against its own weight. Cyrus walked beside the padded crate that held the engine block, one scarred hand resting near the ratchet strap, but never rushing the men doing the lift. He trusted the work. Benedict noticed that more than anything. Malcolm Greer stood near the threshold with gray dust on his polished shoes and the immediate eviction notice folded in one hand, its $3,450 figure no longer looking like generosity, only a small number printed beside a much larger insult. He watched the parts leave in order: frame first, engine crate second, fuel tank wrapped in a stained canvas apron, cracked leather seat, 2 wire wheels, dented headlight bucket, coffee can marked carb screws, and Benedict's ledger sealed inside a clear plastic sleeve. Nothing was grabbed. Nothing was tossed. Every piece was named before it crossed the gate. Benedict checked each item against the ledger before it moved, and Cyrus made sure the clearance workers could see the list from where they stood outside the marked line. The cold afternoon air hit Benedict's face when he stepped outside, carrying the smell of wet pavement, hot rubber, and old oil from the Harleys idling in a quiet row. For years, he had walked that yard as the man who checked locks after everyone else went home. Now he stood there while other men waited for his signal. Short and strange. "Set the block forward of the axle," he said, his voice still rough but steadier than before. "Weight rides better there." The tow operator, a white man with a weathered face and grease under one thumbnail, looked to Cyrus first out of habit, but Cyrus gave him nothing except a nod toward Benedict. The operator turned back to the old watchman. "Forward of the axle it is." Benedict's eyes flickered. The words landed like respect. Malcolm cleared his throat. "This does not change the redevelopment agreement." Cyrus tightened the last strap with 2 clean pulls, then tested the buckle with his palm. "Nobody said it did. And Mr. Arlo still has to vacate." "He is vacating," Cyrus said, "with the stored mechanical property under his custody, his records, and his name intact." The other bikers finished loading the boxes, using moving blankets between metal surfaces, looping orange straps through safe points instead of old spokes, checking each hook twice the way Benedict had taught them inside. One man read from the list while another answered: frame, secured; block, secured; tank, wrapped; seat, tied; bolts, boxed; ledger, sealed. Benedict stood beside the ramp, clutching his brass keys, and looked back through the open foundry doors. Inside, the yellow work lamp still hung over the steel table. The empty spot where the engine had rested looked almost wholly in the dust. Malcolm stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You understand there is no position for you after today." Benedict did not answer right away. He looked at the broken windows, the conveyor chain, the old-time clock frozen at 11:06, and the floor he had swept so many times that the broom handle had worn smooth in his grip. Then he looked at Cyrus. The biker reached into his vest and pulled out a folded card, oil-smudged at one corner. "There is at our place," Cyrus said. Benedict stared at it. "What place?" "Club part shop. Storage building out by Route 19. Shelves are a mess. Men keep tossing good fittings in with junk because they do not know the difference." A faint smile moved under Cyrus's gray beard. "We need a parts manager who knows what still has life in it." Benedict's hand hovered before he took the card. The address was written in block letters, along with a start time: Monday, 8 a.m. There was no speech about charity, no soft music moment, just a job offered like a tool being passed handle first. Benedict swallowed hard, then placed the brass foundry keys on Malcolm's folder one by one, each small clink sharper than an argument. "Then I am vacated," he said. Malcolm looked at the keys, the tow truck, the row of silent bikers, and the old man standing taller in his worn boots. For once, he had no clean sentence ready. Cyrus climbed onto his Harley as the rollback driver raised the ramp with a hydraulic groan. The foundry shrank behind them in the mirrors, cold, rusted, and waiting for its end. But on the truck bed, under two orange straps and a gray blanket, the lost motorcycle was leaving whole enough to begin again. By the time the rollback reached the club parts shop off Route 19, the afternoon had softened into a dull gold that caught on the chrome of the parked Harleys and the oil-dark windows of the storage building. The place was nothing fancy: a long metal structure with a gravel lot, 3 roll-up doors, and shelves visible through the open bay, stacked with fenders, tanks, carburetors, brake drums, old seats, wiring looms, and coffee cans full of bolts no one had labeled well enough. To Benedict Arlo, it looked like chaos at first. Then he stepped closer and saw possibility. Cyrus, iron jaw, Fenwick killed his engine and swung one boot down, his Hell's Angel-style leather vest creaking as he stood beneath the bay light. "This is the mess," he said. "You still want the job?" Benedict looked at the shelves, then at the truck bed where the old motorcycle frame waited under the gray blanket, the cracked engine block strapped safely inside its crate. His hands were tired. His back ached. Iron dust still lined the creases of his knuckles. But his eyes moved over the room the way they had moved over the foundry, measuring space, noticing danger, finding order where other men saw scrap. "First thing," he said quietly, "you need 3 bins. Keep fine thread away from coarse thread. And those fuel fittings should not be anywhere near electrical." One of the adult bikers gave a low chuckle, not mocking, just pleased. Cyrus nodded toward a steel desk near the back wall. On it sat a fresh inventory book, a set of blank tags, a brass key on a split ring, and a yellow work lamp with a new bulb. Benedict stopped when he saw them. No ceremony had been prepared, but every object on that desk had been chosen with care. That made it harder to breathe. "Key opens the side door and the parts cage," Cyrus said. "Desk is yours. Coffee is bad, but it is hot. Pay starts Monday, 8 a.m., like the card said." Benedict reached for the brass key, then paused before touching it, as if afraid it might vanish. "You don't know me well enough to trust me with this." Cyrus looked past him to the old motorcycle being unloaded, then back to the man who had saved bolts for 14 years because waste offended him and truth mattered even when no one listened. "I know enough." Short and sure. The bikers unloaded the frame onto a low stand and set the cracked block beneath the work lamp. No one pretended it would roar back to life that night. No miracle came from the metal. The bracket still needed replacement, the block still needed inspection, and the old bike would take weeks, maybe months, before it could breathe through an engine again. That made it real. Benedict took the first blank tag, wrote in careful pencil, "Foundry bike, restoration start, 3:31 p.m., saved from clearance," then tied it to the frame with a piece of wire. His writing shook at the start, but not at the end. Cyrus watched without interrupting. Outside, the gravel lot settled into evening, and the smell of hot rubber, engine oil, and burnt coffee drifted through the open bay. Benedict sat at the steel desk, laid his old foundry ledger beside the new inventory book, and rested both hands flat on the cover. For the first time in years, he was not waiting for a door to close behind him. He was waiting for work to begin. Some places die because people stop seeing value in them, and some people nearly disappear for the same reason. But a steady hand can still sort the useful from the ruined. A patient eye can still find the truth in a crack, and a rough-looking stranger can sometimes return a man's name to him without making a speech about it. Benedict looked up as Cyrus hung the brass key on the hook beside his new desk. The old watchman smiled once, small and tired, while the yellow lamp shone across the broken engine like sunrise on iron. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.